All right, so this is question 20 on the practice test. We only have one class to deal with, right? So we'll go straight to main and start tracing some code, right? So here I have a string array declaration, right? Or I guess a string array reference, right? And it's called names, and it's apparently pointing to a string array of size 2, right? So here is our array. This is index 0, index 1, right? And we're declaring a new integer, I, and it's going to be equal to 0, right? Okay, so now what are we doing here? This is an enhanced for loop, right? So what it's basically doing is it's creating this name variable. So the name variable is a string, and it's kind of like it's going through the names array, and it's copying the contents of whatever, I guess, index we're in. It's giving it to name, and then it's allowing name to do whatever it wants, or like whatever it wants, right? But it also, like, if name were to change, like the value of name, it doesn't mean that the value of, say, index 0 or whatever index you're at is also going to change, right? It's more like a one-way street unless you fix it. So let's go ahead and look what's happening, right? For the first line, I'm going to copy the contents of index 0, so in other words, null, and set it equal to name. So I copied down the implied null into name. Right? So now I go to this first line here. Name is equal to new string 1, right? So rather than null, it's going to be equal to 1. Now notice how this doesn't immediately change to 1 because they're not connected. You have to do that yourself, right? So now look at the next line, right? I'm indexing at names of I. What is I? It's 0. So I'm indexing at names of 0. And I'm saying, let's set that equal to whatever the value of name is. What is name right now? It's equal to 1, right? So names of 0 is equal to 1. So that looks like this in the array, right? I plus plus just means to increment I. And now we're back here. We're in the next index, right? So I'm going to copy over null into name, right? Now name is equal to new string 1. So a string with the value 1, right? And now I'm saying that names of I, so now names of 1 is equal to whatever value name is. Now name is also 1, right? So I'm saying that names of 1 should be equal to 1. So let's go ahead and do that. And then I plus plus. And of course, if you try to loop again, we realize that we don't have any spaces to loop it. So we are going to stop the for loop, right? That's kind of like one of the perks of enhanced for loops is that it knows when to stop when you've reached out of bounds, right? Okay, so now we're entering this try block. We have a for loop, another enhanced for loop that does pretty much the same thing, but it's just going to print out the entire contents of the array, right? So what is the entire contents of the array? It's just, 1 and 1, right? So if I'm printing out the contents, I get 1, 1, right? That's all this loop does. It just goes through the names array, sets this local variable name equal to the indexes, or I guess whatever is living at those indexes, and it just prints them out, right? Okay, so now moving on to this, I'm going to throw a null pointer exception, right? So what does that do? Well, it does exactly what it says it's doing. It's going to throw an exception, and now we're expecting, or at least we're hoping, that the catch block is going to catch it, right? And of course it will because this is a very generic exception catch, right? Had this been like, I don't know, like an array out of balance exception, it probably wouldn't have caught the null pointer exception, and then your code would have crashed. The finally block would have still ran, but your code would have crashed. That's no good, right? So this catch block does indeed catch the null pointer exception because exception was more generic, right? Exception is probably a parent of the null pointer exception, right? So it caught it. Now I'm just going to run this catch line here, and it's saying to print out error. So that's what I'm going to do. And not probably, by the way, exception is certainly a parent of null pointer exception. right? It's the most generic. And we have finally, like finally always runs when you enter the try block, right? So we're down here, we're running the finally, and it's going to give us A, right? So the expected output is 1 error A. Let's go ahead and check. And yeah, that seems to be the output that we want. I hope that helped.